Good morning. This is March 16th, and as some of you have noted, we have missed a few sessions. Thank you for those of you who got in touch to think there might be some problem with me. Fortunately, that was not the case. It was on the technical side that we had some issues, but hopefully we're now back on our regular every 2-week session. The last time we talked and met, I think, the general topic was the post-World War II 80 years had come to an end, and we were now, in a kind of a new situation. But it was totally unclear what kind of situation. And in the last weeks, we have moved from, a new era beginning to new situations having arisen, which are quite dire and which essentially have now changed the international system. For how long and what to do about it and where this will all end, we don't know. But this morning, I want to address where we are at the moment, and say a few things about it. I think one of the ways to put it is, we went from a post-World War II order to a lack of clarity what the new order would look like. And now we can say that we are in a new world order, which is quite out of control, and where this will all end is also quite out of control. Many of the old issues continue to fester. The Ukraine, the mess in Gaza. Yes, there's supposedly a ceasefire, but 80% of the Gazans are still living in tents and not having adequate food and water. And the Israeli section of Gaza is still shooting people on the other side. So while hundreds of people aren't dying in a week, there are still 25, 30 people getting shot, presumptively because Israelis are imagining that they're targeting Hamas people, and they may in fact be, but also children and women are still getting killed. So that is still a monumental mess, and it hasn't gotten a lot of attention in the papers recently for the obvious reason of the Iran situation. Now, without have been watching the news, you know that we attacked Iran. We know that the Ayatollah was killed. He is now being replaced by his son, who seems to be injured, and who also lost his wife and wife and child. And the current regime is still in power, and the Trump administration has said that they're going to overthrow the regime when they started all of this. Now it looks like maybe they're not going to overthrow the regime, but it's unclear exactly where this is all going to wind up and where it's going to lead. Obviously, you also know from the news that it is Israel and the United States who are presumptively trying to bring down the Iranian regime. And Israel is also busying itself with attacks again in Lebanon, presumptively to kill off the rest of Hezbollah, but in the meantime causing huge damage both in Beirut and elsewhere. And somewhere in the neighborhood of 1 million Lebanese have been told to leave their homes and try to go to safer towns. And I believe by today, maybe slightly over 800 Lebanese have been killed. Then, contrary to the past, the Gulf states, which have, in a sense, tried to stay out of the Israel-Gaza, Israel now Iran situation, are deeply involved. They used to be involved as peacekeepers and diplomats. Dubai, you may recall, was the place where negotiations took place to try to sort out the Gaza conflict and other conflicts in the area. And those Gulf states, which are small, but which are affluent. One of the things that has not been mentioned very much in the news is that the populations of those states of native people, that is to say, people, Qataris and so forth, are very small compared to the actual population living in those states, because many of them are simply workers from places like the Philippines and Indians. So the indigenous population of those states is fairly small, but as you've also seen on TV, these capitals are very modern, high-rise buildings and so forth. And they are now also getting attacked by the conflict by Israel and drones and so forth. So what started out from the perspective of the Trump administration of what he thought was a fairly quick getting rid of the regime in Iran has now spread to the whole region, is involved in one way or the other. And the latest attempt, because of the shipping problems of oil in the Gulf of Hormuz, has been that Trump has tried to get the Europeans and NATO involved in all of this to help demine the Gulf so that oil vessels and other commerce can flow more quickly. And has essentially said yesterday, I believe, that since the US was helping NATO with Ukraine, the least that the Europeans could do is help with the conflict that you now have in the Middle East. The Europeans are not very keen on doing this. Of course, they would like to have access to the commerce and the oil of oil commerce as well as other commerce in the Gulf of Hormuz, but they are not very keen on getting sucked in to the conflict that Netanyahu and Trump started. So as I tape this, and it may be different in a few days, essentially England, France, and so on, is very hesitant to get themselves involved and to send boats and peoples and demining equipment and so forth. In the meantime, you might have noticed that not only in the Gulf of Hormuz, but there's an island sticking out, which is the exit for a fair amount of the oil and has oil reserves from Iran there. And the US has now decided that it needed to get rid of that capacity. But by capacity, they don't want to get rid of the oil because that's needed internationally, but rather they have now targeted the infrastructure behind the oil reserve canisters and so on. So from the perspective of the United States, we're sort of making this up on a day-to-day basis. Trump almost each day says slightly different things. The Secretary of Defense says even different things during his news conference. Sounds very confident, very in charge. We'll deal with this in a few days. And essentially blames reports on how badly things are going. That is to say, the extent to which Iran is willing to absorb the targets against them, and still has capacity to reach out, to send drones, to bomb, and so forth. That this is all a function, said the Secretary of Defense the other day, of misinformation by channels like CNN. And then, for good measure, he added that he looks forward to Paramount, which will be run by the son of the head of Oracle, and they're right wingers and Trump people, that they will now be buying also CNN, which is part of the Paramount purchase, and that then CNN will no longer be what it is today. It'll more resemble Fox News. So that was a sort of an aside by the Secretary of Defense of, all the misinformation you all have about how well American activities are going with respect to Iran are fictions of television and bad news reporting and so on. So in some senses, we're living in a situation in which things are changing on a daily basis, and where each time, President Trump gets interviewed coming into or coming down from an airplane, he says slightly different things. This was all going to be over very quickly. Now it'll be over in a few years, a few weeks. One person gets interviewed from our U.S. government, which says, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, maybe 4 or 5 or 6 weeks. And in the meantime, there is now the idea of shipping American forces to the Gulf. And, for example, Marines, which would, under normal circumstances, will be people who go on land to fight. And now the open question becomes, is the US government really going to send Marines to invade Iran? Really? Seriously? Boots on the ground? What will this lead to? Minimally, it will lead to quite a few American casualties. So the state, you would think that I could clarify the situation to some extent, but there's no clarity in this. We're making it up on a day-to-day basis. Now, one of the things about Iran is that it comes across, or in the minds of many people, it's just one of these big, in this case, big because 90 million plus people live in Iran, sort of third world countries. But Iran is one of the most ancient cultures. It is an educated population. It is, comparing it to, I don't know, some African third world country, or at least to indicate that we're this, at the forefront civilization, Europe and the United States, and then there's Iran, which is this backward country and so forth, is of course a fiction. Iran has had a horrible regime. And it is, been governed by dictators. But that is not to say that Iran is sort of this pushover third world country. It is anything but. And I think there must be some surprise on the part of President Trump and his administration of the extent to which Iran is willing to absorb damage and not necessarily, throw up its arms and say, we give up. There are a authoritarian government, which is the Iranian government, is willing to take a lot of damage. I mean, don't forget all the people that were killed during the uprisings before the US ever got involved there. So, 10,000 people here, 10,000 people there. Authoritarian regime like the Iranian regime is willing to absorb that. And obviously right now, Iran is willing to absorb a fair amount of harm. Now, I think, the US and the Trump administration would like to get out of there sooner rather than later. and are willing, I think, in the end, to leave without having overthrown the regime. This is not quite so on the part of Israel. And Israel and the United States are now parting, to some extent, directions that they wish to go to, because Israel is really intent to simply, bomb and missile and whatnot Iran until it disintegrates. And that may take a while, especially now that Israel is also very busy in Lebanon and not to mention Gaza. So it's not clear that Israel, which in many ways pushed Trump administration into this whole state of affairs with Iran right now, and the United States are still on the same page in terms of their desires, at which point they would just pull out of Iran and so forth. In the meantime, of course, the world is in trouble in terms of oil. You've noticed it at the gas pump. It's going to get worse. Many countries are, including China, are used to getting oil from that part of the world, so they have an interest in it. And to some extent, the Russians are laughing all the way home, because the sanctions that the US had applied to Russia because of Ukraine have essentially been lifted. So now Russia is in a position to sell its oil and at whatever price, and the sanctions have been lifted. So this is good for Putin, and not so good for the Ukraine. An ironic little aside is the fact that Ukraine has some drone missiles and so forth, which it was willing to help our government with at this point, because we didn't have adequate numbers, and the Trump administration declined. So you now have an oil crisis worldwide. You have no much news has come into being in terms of other parts of the world. Ukraine is trying to hold its own. Gaza is still in a monumental mess. The US government is now decided to maybe put our attention to someplace else, which is Cuba. And now Cuba, of course, getting oil from Venezuela, is now not getting oil. The Cubans are literally starving. They have no electricity and so forth. And this is a very good time for the president and the Secretary of State to decide, so now we're going to, make peace with Cuba, either by taking it over or getting the regime to compromise with the United States. So the Cubans who are still in Cuba are in dire straits, without electricity, without food, all brought by the United States. They've been brought to their knees. And so the next activity will be, what will we be doing in Cuba? In the meantime, you have a situation in which, the Europeans, as I mentioned, have been asked to help with demining and other things in the Gulf, and they're very hesitant to get involved. And my editorial comment here would be, can one blame them? I mean, on the one hand, they are also affected by the war through commerce and oil and so forth. On the other hand, do they really want to be dragged into the mess that the Trump administration has created, both in Latin America and in the Middle East? Then there's China, and China also gets oil from the Gulf. And so President Trump is trying to get China, in a sense, on our side to help with the situation. I think China is fairly careful in not getting dragged in beyond a certain point. President Trump is supposed to go to China in 2 weeks. That may be canceled either on the American side or the Chinese side or both for the time being. But China does have an interest in the commerce in the oil and the Gulf of Hormuz. So it's interesting to what extent this little war, which was Trump originally said, in a couple of days he could bring Iran to heel, is now moving into the third week, and in some ways has become a kind of a global, not exactly a global conflict, but it involves the globe. I mean, everybody hasn't gotten involved. It involves the globe. Now, if I may just make an aside, which is some other talk, which is that some of the European countries are less affected by the oil prices and the lack of access to oil because they have converted rather seriously to alternate energy. So some of the small European countries are now getting 75, 80% of their energy, not from oil, but from wind, for example, and solar, for example. So even though President Trump says climate change is a hoax, and by the way, let's look at the tornadoes and so forth in the eastern part of the United States right now, but he says climate is a hoax, and he's shutting down laboratories, I think right now one in Colorado, doing climate research. The Europeans have taken climate change very seriously and are massively converting to other sources of energy. And as I said, some small countries in Europe are at the point of which almost somewhere between 70 and 90% of their energy sources no longer come from fossil fuels, which is quite amazing that it can be done, that it has been done, and that other countries in the world are taking taking the situation seriously. What I guess I'm saying, and I'm trying to say it as starkly as possible, we are now living not in a new world order, but a new world disorder. And that was not the case a few months ago. I mean, there was Ukraine, there was Gaza, and so forth. But we're now dealing with a global crisis of sorts. How this is going to sort out, unclear. Depends on the next few weeks and so on. But no matter how it sorts itself out, the standing of the US will be fundamentally more eroded than it was a few months ago. The respect of the US will be eroded more so than it was a few months ago. And while all of this is going on, we are also in the domestic mess of, trying to build 1,000 people holding cells all over the country for all these immigrants, or supposedly all these immigrants, they're all illegal, and most of them are criminal. By the way, 70% of the people that have been institutionalized here, there, and yonder are not in the broadest sense illegal. That is to say, they were waiting for their green cards and so on, and children and women and so on. And the percentage of actual criminals is somewhere between 20 and 25%, and many of these so-called criminals are not people who've murdered anybody or have long criminal records. I mean, minor traffic infractions and so on. So not only does the world now look at the US as quite crazed in terms of the Middle East and the Iraqi situation, but also quite crazed in terms of its domestic circumstances and what it's doing to its population. Ironically, you might have noticed that since most of the farm workers in our area and other areas are theoretically people who could be deported or sent to these holding institutions, the farmers have screamed bloody murder. And because, of course, things need to be harvested so that we can go to our food stores and buy fruits and vegetables and whatnot. So they have gotten permission to continue to have their workers work on the farms. So there is a kind of making policies which seem consistent with what the Trump administration says it stands for. And then they see the disarray caused not only internationally, but in the rest of the world and outside of the Gulf area and even domestically. And then from day to day, they change their mind in one fashion or another. So the most obvious vision that somebody could get for overseas, other countries could get, is a country in which, decisions are made on the one hand by a totally incompetent Secretary of Defense, and who was his only qualification was as a Fox News host, right? Having gotten rid of very large chunks of competent State Department people, for example, and certainly US AID, and a president who makes things up. And when he was asked, I think it was yesterday, when he thought that, we would pull out of Iran and stop whatever we're doing there, a normal in the past president might have given some substantive reasons or a discussion of policy alternatives and endpoints. What Trump said was he's going to stop in Iran when he feels it in his bones. So that's where we are. It is not only very sad, it is very disturbing. It is, I think, very difficult for you all to watch the news in the evening and to see what's going on. But the genie is going to be difficult to put back together again. It is not just that we ended or we made a major contribution. We ended the post-World War II structure, even though it was frayed of 80 years. But we've now created a new world disorder, which will be very difficult to harness in some fashion and to put the genie back in the bottle again. I think most of us can't recall, even though we went through wars in Vietnam and so on, can't recall a crisis of US policy and a world crisis of different kinds so out of control as it is at this very moment. So I'm sorry to be so down and so negative about it, but there is at the moment no good news on the US foreign policy front, both because of the Middle East, and by the Middle East, I mean all the Muslim countries, but I also mean Israel and what it is doing in its region. I suppose at the end of the day, we in the America can say, well, we have, we're not part of geographically of that part of the world, but Israel will be, and it's hard to think why Israel's interests, long-term interests to live peacefully in that part of the world is in any way fostered by its current policies and current actions in Gaza, in Lebanon, in amongst the Gulf states and Iran. If one wished Israel well and wanted it to live a long and peaceful life in its region, the past weeks have hardly enhanced that prospect, I would say. We'll see you again in a couple of weeks. Hope the news will be better then.